Well, good afternoon again.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for being with us. Hope you're enjoying lunch. It's a real pleasure to host this entire event today, and a real pleasure to listen to the wisdom from the panelists in our first session, and of course, always a pleasure to hear the Attorney General of Texas. I think our staff members will probably move this podium back just a little bit so that I can give the evil eye to these folks on this side of the theater. No, just kidding. You might want to give me the evil eye. Thanks, Clint. A couple of announcements before we get started. We have a live stream audience today, so if you're joining us virtually, we appreciate that. I'll also say that if you're not aware, and you probably aren't because it's been a soft launch, Texas Public Policy Foundation is now doing a weekly podcast called The Foundation. And the purpose of it is not just to talk about TPPF matters, and for that matter, not just to talk about Texas matters, but to talk about the foundational principles of the conservative movement. And there are many excellent voices in the movement, and what we want to do is feature those voices. I can tell you that one of the heroes for me and my wife in modern America is Dr. Tim Huelskamp. He's a courageous former member of Congress, courageous head of one of our fellow think tanks, one of the truly important organizations in America. And we are grateful that we're beginning to do more and more work together. So Tim, thanks for being with us. A little bit more about Tim Huelskamp. He is a Kansan and earned his, I say that with great compliment, hook 'em.
Used to be part of Texas.
That's correct. See?
I am from Southwest Kansas, and the Texas flag flew over my home county and farm, so we have a connection.
We got you well prepped.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice job. You see, this audience is going to love you. He earned his PhD in political science from American University. What you're going to hear from Dr. Huelskamp is not only, believe it or not, what's important from academics, being one myself, but also having lived the experience of trying to drain the swamp before it was fashionable. So what we're going to do today is hopefully have a wide-ranging conversation. Tim's going to guide us through some of the things he's seen in his experience as a congressman, for that matter, as a farmer, as a Kansan, as an American. And what we're hopeful that we'll be able to do by the end of this session, even before we get to your Q&A, is give you a sense of some of the policy areas where you might be involved, where you might be able to take some action. Because ultimately, if all we do is talk about problems and sort of academic solutions, we're not serving the best interest of the organizations where we work. So, Dr. Huelskamp, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You bet. So let's talk about the extent of the problem of the administrative state. Just to frame that for us, we've had a recent election where, among other factors that went into the reasons the victor won, one of them was that he put his finger on a long-standing frustration of Americans of different demographic groups, and that is that they felt increasingly powerless and even over their elected officials, that there are these people, perhaps well-intentioned, serving in agencies, making administrative rules that they had little control over. And I'm just hopeful that maybe in this first part of our conversation, you can help us with the experience you've had, give us some insight into the extent of that problem. So you're not required to be an optimist yet when you answer that question.
Well, you say draining the swamp.
That's right.
The swamp has yet to be drained. You go to any of these federal agencies and the appointees, if they have their positions, and plenty of them, plenty of those positions are still vacant, you literally have hundreds and thousands of people that are still there, and they're always going to be there, civil servants. And most of them haven't. It reminds me of a story of a home builder in Kansas, or a gentleman ran the Home Building Association in Kansas, had a meeting at the EPA, and the meeting room was at the back of one of the big EPA buildings. As you go through there, every other cubicle had a sign, "Save the whale, save the seal, save everything but save the babies." That's a different one. So, everything. But the point being is there's a certain ideological bent. That's why they're there. That's why they work at the EPA. And I was telling you my frustration 6 years in Congress. The Attorney General lamented the fact that Congress often would say they were concerned about that, but they wouldn't do anything. They were concerned about DACA, but they went ahead and funded that. They were concerned about the Waters of the U.S. rule, which would involve every puddle that's there overnight would suddenly become a federal jurisdictional matter. But Congress went ahead, Republican control, and funded the EPA every time. Well, can't we defund their efforts on WOTUS? Well, we could, but we didn't. Can we defund their efforts on DACA? Well, we could, but we didn't. On and on we went. So it's a function of the entire swamp. And you know, I was thinking ahead to this talk. A former colleague of mine, Congressman from Colorado, Ken Buck, has a book he released in April. I'm sure that made him a lot of friends around Washington, D.C. and Congress to say, hey, we need to drain the swamp in Congress. And we can get into that at length of what goes on and why members of Congress say one thing at home but can't seem to get anything done in Washington, D.C. But a little more background. American University, by the way, is in Washington, D.C., and I was in there in the early 90s, and somehow, some way, they let me out with a PhD, and I went back home to farm in the real world and got into state politics. But I will tell you, I served 14 years in the state Senate, and my colleagues, after I went to Washington, I'd come back to Kansas every weekend, by the way, and they said, what'd you think about Washington? Is it everything you expected? I said, oh yes, and much worse. And after 6 years, ladies and gentlemen, I saw very little positive changes, even with Republican control, because of the administrative state. If you're discussing, you know, you got a multi-trillion-dollar budget and you discuss $10 billion every year, well, what about the trillions that are still there? And it was so easy. And I will have to give credit. We're live streaming, so that's dangerous. But President Barack Obama ran circles around Republican leadership in Washington. You know, on one hand, he could get them distracted on all kinds of things. Meanwhile, he's pushing WOTUS, DACA, Clean Power Plan. Al Gore, how long ago did he lose? Thank goodness it's hard to remember when he lost. His philosophy and his principles on environmental issues still run the EPA today. And Pruitt's trying to undo those, but that takes time. By the way, he's doing an excellent job. I think he's probably the best appointee of the entire administration, following through what he promised to do. So that administrator is doing a great job. But the endangerment finding, by the way, which says CO2 will kill us all, which, by the way, I'm a farmer. I love CO2. I'll be upfront. I just love it. That is still the letter of law in America. That's the basis for the Clean Power Plan and numerous other things. So it will take some time. But I will say in the EPA we see that corner turn. But today, Pruitt's under investigation by his own Attorney General. Why? Because he installed a super secret phone booth in his office to make certain EPA staffers wouldn't listen into his private calls and try to throw lawsuits, I presume, and undo everything he's doing. That's the swamp. And it's hard. You've got to be loud about it and pushing back, and that's what I see in this administration. So a little bit of flavor on the EPA side and plenty of other issues I think we'll talk about, Kevin.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. I think you've given us sufficient reason for pessimism in your first
well, it's
response.
also sufficient reason to understand why I'm not in Congress anymore. So, by the way, under the DACA issue, you know, here we have states like Kansas and Texas and plenty of others fighting this issue. We had a few members of Congress that said, you know what, we shouldn't fund DACA, you know, led by Steve King and numerous others. I think that was in the spring of, I think, 2015. And so we led the charge. Says, well, why would we fund the president's? We just won the Senate. Why would we give money to fund DACA? Remember, after the elections were won, we got a majority in the Senate. Soon after that election is when the president said, no, I'm going to rewrite the law on immigration. What do you do about it? Congress says we have to fund every one of those things. So actually, it turned so much that about 30 conservatives, myself included, had television and radio ads ran against us by Republican leaders in Washington, that we were holding up funding of the military over a little thing called the Constitution. And by the way, those ads weren't very effective, by the way, but that shows you what the swamp would do. They're so willing just to keep things going and not make any changes, at least from the congressional perspective as well as the agency perspective.
Mm-hmm. So what about the role of Congress in at least contributing to that problem, if they didn't make the problem? And the context for that question is almost an academic diagnosis of that. And I might want to view that historically. You will want to view that from the standpoint as a political scientist. In other words, if we had 100 students in a lecture hall here and they asked you, Dr. Huelskamp, how did this happen? How would you respond?
It's kind of like a question I often get when I was a state legislator as a member of Congress. I'd have young folks come up to me and said, Tim, That's in Kansas. They still called you by your first name, which is much better than what they called me in Washington, by the way. But they'd say, hey, one day I want to be in politics. What do I need to do? And, that's the wrong question to ask if you want to be in American politics and understand our founders. I often say, well, first you need a job. Then I also suggest you might actually want to run a business. You actually might want to have a family and might understand life before you get in politics. But so much of politics, folks in there are populated by people. That's their first question. They want to get in there instead of living life. And our founders, they did all these things before they got in politics. They didn't wake up at 17 and say, hey, I'm going to be president of the United States. And I don't know when our President Obama did, but he kind of had that thought. He's going to be president one day. But that's the wrong perspective. So it becomes an in and of itself. And so even if you have the right intentions, the right principles, whether you're in the state level or the federal level, it's how much you want to keep the job. And if you're not willing to give up the job, you're not going to do a good job at it. And I would say, in my humble opinion, most members of Congress in both parties, they would never give up their job. They would choose to give up the principle before they give up the job. And that's on both sides. So at the end of the day, presidents know that. They know Congress is toothless. And I think President Trump has figured that out, that Congress is more interested in keeping their job than, why would Congress give up the authority? And I toyed with that the first 5 or 6 years up there, say, if they would ever figure out that it was all about power and control, that they'd want to keep that. But no, it's really not so much about power control, it's just keeping the job and the position. And that is certainly not what our founders intended. Now, think about the founders and think about what they're writing in the Constitution. It's not taught in most public schools today, but they wrote the Constitution this way because they were imposing the Constitution, think about this, on themselves. They knew they'd be the future. They were the current future leaders. But think about it. They didn't even trust themselves. They didn't trust themselves. They were going to live under that. And by the way, the first article of the Constitution has to do with the courts. No, the president. Oh, no, it deals with Congress. That's not an accident. They understood that was supposed to be the preeminent branch. But that's been lost along the way. But in a sense, it's still this whole thing like in Ken Buck's book talks about it, draining the swamp. It needs to start in the congressional level as well. There's just too many folks up there that have spent 20 years to get there, and then once they get there, they can't figure out why they're even there anymore. Mm-hmm. Same way getting committee chairmanships. Peter Schweitzer, anybody heard of Peter Schweitzer? Clinton Cash and plenty of other things. He wrote a book called Extortion. He talked about Congress, and he talks about, it's absolutely true. What's the price tag on getting on the Ways and Means Committee in the House? Let me ask that again. Let me ask it this way. Is there a price tag to be on the House Ways and Means Committee? Absolutely. What is it today? I don't know. Back when Peter wrote the book, it was about $1 million in campaign fundraising. And you take that campaign fundraising and you give it to leadership. And then leadership uses that to elect more people just like you. And then it becomes a very top-down process, and then Obama runs circles around this. But Peter outlines under both parties that money runs the game, and he outlines specifically, and I actually helped contribute to some of the information in the book that bills would come. Here's an example. The agenda in Congress was set up about once a week. The majority leader on a Friday would send us out and says, here are the bills we're going to consider in Congress next week. This is a Republican Congress, by the way. And I'd get home after voting, jump on a plane, get home, see my family in the real world like 5, 6 o'clock at night. Then about Friday evening, a few hours later, we'd get the agenda for next week of 50 or 60 or 70 bills that might be considered, many of them on Monday. Where did they come from? Why are they on there? I don't know where they came from. There was no advance notice other than Friday will come back on Monday. And Peter outlines in this book is under both parties, if you were the special interest that did well enough at a fundraiser the week before that, your bill would come up on the agenda on the calendar. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the swamp. That's the congressional swamp, the one I'm most familiar with. And that is still going on today. And on my way out, they have this process in the House in which on Mondays when folks are flying back, they have these most debates. Oh, by the way, most debates in Washington are superficial. You think you know that, right? I often say it's all theater in Washington, and usually very bad theater. It's not even very good at that. So, but in the House, the debates are even more limited. But on Monday, they have very limited debate where it's 10 minutes on both sides. And it's amazing how often both sides agree. You have the Democrat and the Republican leadership agree that we shouldn't do anything about the administrative state. And then we'll vote on 40 or 50 votes sometimes on a Monday evening, a first time back. And those would get super majority, and then they could rush them through. So my final few weeks, I said, I don't like that anymore. So if one person just stands up and says, I call for a vote on this, all of a sudden they can't do that anymore. Same thing in the Senate. And so I did that a few times. That's the way you make friends as you're leaving in both the House and the Senate. I think I learned that from Senator Cruz, a friend of mine, about standing up. But what that does show, that despite what I think is corruption there, and years-long corruption of both parties, and just the swamp, and the creatures of the swamp, is you still have cases where one man or one woman can actually change the direction, change the debate, and actually make a difference, that is the American spirit. And that's what still makes us different, that we can still make a difference. So when the young folks come to me, I say, hey, this is the resume. You should have a real life before you get in politics. But if you're focused and based on those principles, you can go and make a difference. And I will say, as an aside, this is one reason I'm at the Heartland Institute. We are a national think tank, but we work in nearly every state of America, because we believe, understand that most of the action, definitely most of the good action, will happen in the state of Texas, the state of Kansas, and every other state, and not in Washington, D.C. And we've got a bunch of initiatives on that, and we can talk about that later, Kevin.
Sure. It reminds me of one of many comments that Alexis de Tocqueville made in the 1820s about Americans. And that is, it doesn't really matter what the political system is. In other words, what we might call the structure. What really matters is the virtue of the citizens themselves. And so we can sit here all afternoon and with very good reason cite all of the examples of how our freedom is altered in a negative way by the administrative state, by Washington. But it all comes back to, I would argue, to a societal and cultural challenge, right? And that's a way that for people who are listening to you very rightly, very accurately list problems with the administrative state that you've experienced, can figure out how they themselves participate in the solution. So I want to come back to that, but I want folks to know that we're going to do a good job of beating up the administrative state, because it needs to be beaten up and the swamp needs to be drained. But really, ultimately, this is sort of something that's going to be laid on our feet. So with that in mind, were there any victories when you were in Congress, whether led by you or someone else, whether large or small, that give us some hope that this can be fixed, and maybe some model of how it can be fixed?
Were there any victories? There's a University of San Antonio professor, I don't know which one it is, accused me of helping elect Donald Trump because I tweeted something about King Obama. So really, I mean, that's how you get a little tension in Washington. But that's the case. We had elected a king, and we had elected representatives that weren't doing anything about it. And there's always that danger and that possibility. So I think laying that out, and the American people, made that choice. It says we're going to go a different route. And you can never quite figure out why people vote the way they do, and whether they did that because of their frustration about whatever. But certainly populism is alive and well again, and I think Donald Trump tapped into that. And members of my former colleagues, many of them were on the wrong side of that. Who would have thought a Speaker of the House would stand up before the election and say, don't vote for president, our presidential nominee, or at least suggest that. And yesterday, Donald Trump tweeted, says, "Hope he stays as Speaker of the House." These are interesting times. So, but what it gets back to on particular issues that I think sometimes we get the government we deserve, and the government we pick, but what I've seen particularly on some minor issues, I guess. Here's what I see as probably the biggest victory. The impact of constituents is still very real. And we'd be sitting in a Republican conference generally on a Thursday or a Friday before we wrapped up the week. And A couple times some big issues would come up, and groups on the outside, conservative groups generally, would start generating phone calls to Republicans, say, don't do this bad thing, go do this good thing. And they'd walk in, my former colleagues, and say, oh my God, I'm getting all these phone calls. And you would say, okay, well, what do you think about that? Like, now I'm going to have to do what they told me to do. Let me repeat that. Now I'm going to have to do what they told me to do. Two things here. One, do I really have to do what they tell me to do? Two, they do take orders if they think they're going to lose their job. So just a couple days of phone calls. And it doesn't take many calls to keep a congressional office's phone line busy. It doesn't make a difference. And they're still responding to what people want. So part of our job here is making sure they know what we want. Don't assume that. And by the way the system is set up, they don't take calls and worry about anybody outside their congressional district. And they're not supposed to put together this national database. It's all based on constituents. And so, yeah, we're going to necessarily lose plenty of folks who are never going to get our phone calls. But for those that, I would say, as a Republican, on the Republican side, we can light up their phone calls, their phones, and do make a difference. So that was always heartening to me, that if enough people called in, they do the right thing. I think the closest we got to a victory against the administrative states when we had the shutdown in 2013, and the standoff lasted, I can't remember how many, 2 or 3 weeks, and it was a fascinating time in terms of the political theater and the folks that were making it. So remember that? Remember Obamacare? We were all opposed to that as Republicans. Remember that? That was the days when they really were opposed to that. And we were really going to do something about it. And we were going to defund it, take the money away. At the end of the day, it was fully funded. It was fully funded. And at the end of the day, as I predicted in July, when they had the votes to do it, they couldn't repeal it. But what I want to tell you, one thing that is hopeful moving forward, and why I'm at the Heartland Institute, among other reasons, is every state now has the opportunity. Your state of Texas has the opportunity, and you're doing it already. Texas Public Policy Foundation is helping lean on this. Go to your governor and your state Medicaid director, your state legislature said, get us out of Obamacare. Give us a waiver. Get us out of all these Medicaid strings from Washington, D.C. Let us take control of our health care destiny in your own state. And so what I do see is not that Congress is going to do, I don't think they're going to do anything about Obamacare. Frankly, they're very likely to beef up the funding and the subsidies of the exchanges in exchange for some votes for a couple senators from the Northeast on a tax bill. They're going to put more money on Obamacare. But what we need to do right now is go into the Health and Human Services Office says, hey, we want to require every Texan that wants to be on Medicaid and is able to work should actually go look for a job.
That's a novel concept.
Can you imagine that? And they say they're going to approve that. But here's the secret that even HHS is not ready and willing today. Any state could go in and make this request. And it has to come through the legislature and go through the governor. It has to be passed as a bill. They could go in and say, hey, I want to repeal the individual mandate. I want to repeal the employee mandate. I want to reinstitute high-risk pools, which, by the way, worked before Obamacare and were made illegal under Obamacare. You could actually get rid of 90% of Obamacare through a waiver. Again, it's a Mother May I deal, and I understand that. But there is a Mother May I that should be willing to do that. And I've been pretty surprised. Very few states have even talked about doing that. That's one thing we've been promoting at the Heartland Institute, say go in and challenge the administration, challenge Washington and say, hey, you said you get rid of Obamacare. It's obviously not going to happen, so let Texans get rid of it. Let Kansans get rid of the mandate and go back on our way. I don't know the specific numbers in Texas from my home state of Kansas. Think about this. Under the high-risk pool in Kansas, we were insuring over 300 high-risk individuals, the highest risk individuals in the entire state. They couldn't get insurance everywhere, and they mandated coverage under them. Their premiums 3 years ago are lower today than the average Obamacare exchange premium. So look what we've succeeded in doing, raising everybody's premiums, including those that had the highest risk in Kansas. And they did that by making high-risk pools illegal. You could go in today as the state of Texas and say, hey, we want to start those again and do it in a state-centered manner consistent with states' rights. Let's get that done.
So why do you think so few states will do that?
Why didn't they do that? I think they thought Congress would do something about Obamacare. And
Oh, come on, I wanted to be more pessimistic. I wanted to make,
okay, well, here's a more pessimistic, we're working on this, again, this Medicaid waiver project. We've engaged an outside consultant group that helps states write these waivers, and they're very bureaucratic, and we get that. It shouldn't be Mother May I, but that's where we're stuck at. Why? According to this consultant, out of all the state Medicaid directors, there's one for every state, probably 99 to 100% of them are socialist.
yeah, that's where I was going.
These are the folks that are running the system. But at the end of the day, they respond to the Texas legislature and the governor. They can direct them to do that. And I don't think they are in every state, but that was the opinion. These are folks that since 1965 have decided big government health care is going to solve our problems. And so what I'm suggesting here is draining the swamp basically is please get permission from the swamp, and I'm not expecting them to do anything good other than maybe a little tax reform here in the next week.
Sure. If there's ever a time for us as states to ask the Mother May I question, it would be now, right? And where I was going with my pessimism was that I would make the claim and offer a lot of evidence that state governments, even those in culturally conservative states, have become part of the swamp problem because of the amount of federal funding that flows into state capitals. Am I
absolutely.
mistaken?
Absolutely. I've sat many a day on the floor of the Kansas State Senate and said, well, why are we doing this? Well, there's 10 million. The numbers are smaller in Kansas, by the way. Oh, we'll get $10 million from the feds if we do this. Really? So what do we give up in exchange for that? Well, it's just free. Kind of free money, and that's in Medicaid, that's in your transportation stuff, that's certainly in education as well. And by the way, if we want to win the cultural war and restore what our founders intended, you've got to cut the strings to Washington on education.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got the right secretary, but members of Congress on this issue on education, before I left, you think about the politics of this. So you had all the members of Congress that were Republicans saying they didn't like President Obama on so many different things. But right before he left, they re-upped No Child Left Behind, gave it a new name, dusted it off, and gave it back to the American people and said, that's good for another 5 years. Now, why would you do that if you were hoping for a Republican president with a Republican Congress? And we're saying, wait, stop. No, they went ahead and re-upped it. So No Child Left Behind was re-upped with a Republican Congress and says, we're going to keep doing the same thing. And so for 5 years. So, but Secretary DeVos, again, I think in case she brings in 2 or 3 folks, I think she's doing all she can do. But members in Congress on this issue that run these committees, they really don't want to change anything, K through 12 education. In a way, they believe that at the end of the day, they know better. It reminds me of a story. I was in the state senate. We were debating Medicaid issues and the regulations of nursing homes, and I represent a very rural area, and I remember a gal, senator from another area, and I were debating the regulations of state nursing homes, why we didn't need a new regulator to take care of those, and why folks need to be personal responsibility and their families engaged. And the senator said, well, I've got my mom and dad are in a nursing home. I said, well, you do this as nice as you can in Senate floor. Well, don't you ever go check on them? Don't you ever go check on the nursing home yourself? Why are you wanting me to do that for you or hire somebody to do that? So, and at the end of the day, that passed. But that's the debate that takes place in state legislators all the time. They don't want to be personally responsible because oftentimes Americans don't want to be personally responsible.
It does come back to us.
We have to challenge them. Absolutely, it does, particularly on K through 12 education. I mean, you never turn your kids over to, we worry every day about, well, who's our babysitter going to be? But do we ask who our teacher is of our kids? And babysitters, we want the government to pick that as well. So it comes down to it. So you have this tendency, and it's in a way it's getting worse. But it is nice to know, despite what happened in Washington yesterday, at least the internet's still up. Because remember, it was going to end today if we restored it to a rule 2 years ago. So there's always hope. But isn't that strange? We celebrate the fact guy did what he said he was going to do. And that is stunning in Washington. Yeah. And that's oftentimes what conservatives would do in the Republican conference, stand up and say, well, let's just do what we promised to do. Well, really? Do we really want to do that now? And so I mean, it's very pessimistic, but it also is hopeful that when you have federal leadership and state leadership that is willing to say enough is enough, we have the folks in the right offices today. And like my friends at OMB. Mick Mulvaney. I mean, if you want to believe in states' rights and take control of your destiny, you've got a friend there. And so now's the time to step up. I know Texas Policy Foundation is doing it, but in so many of these areas, but education is probably the most frustrating area in which, oh my gosh, and that's when we're talking about the next generation, that's probably where we've fallen short the most.
And Heartland, if you don't know, has just been the leader for a long time in education policy. Before we move off from education to some other issues, we talked about K-12 education. Higher education has been dramatically affected by the over-involvement of the federal government. Would you frame that for us and maybe posit a couple of solutions? I'm thinking about student loans in particular.
The House Education Committee passed a bill, I think, a couple days ago, and the chairwoman noted that after, I don't know, 9 loan forgiveness programs and 16 student loan programs and everything, we still, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's the problem, that we have too much federal involvement. But it'll be very difficult to have folks in Washington on the Republican or Democrat side. They don't want to go that route. They still want to control from top down.
Yeah.
And so what's the solution? The state's got to step up. And you know, even like the bathroom issue. I was one of the few members of Congress that actually said, well, Mr. President, I don't think you have a right to tell my 112 school districts what to do. And so I did something you probably wasn't supposed to do. I wrote a letter to every superintendent and tried to find every school board member and just thought I'd let you know the president has no authority to tell you what to do with your bathrooms. And you think, well, what's the response? Most of the superintendents either didn't respond or they ran the media and says, oh, we disagree. Mm-hmm. We disagree. You know, and that's when you know you have a problem at the state level, plus at the federal level. And so he was echoing what you know, the liberal control of our schools, what's going on here. So that will be difficult, but you know, I think Donald Trump tapped into it when he talked again and again about Common Core and what that reflects. And there's so much surrounding that issue. And I think Donald Trump is excellent at taking a lot of thoughts, grabbing some words and packing them together, and that reflects much more than Common Core and much less than Common Core in a lot of things. Mm-hmm. Of course, I don't think he ever had anything to do with Common Core. It has nothing to do with his life and his background, but he understood what it meant, and it meant people are frustrated about their schools, and we can do better. And so Heartland for the last 3 decades has been promoting school choice, some types of savings accounts, a way to put mom and dad back in charge. And if we don't do that, at the end of the day, I mean, we will lose, I think, every other battle.
Yeah, and it's the problem in K through 12 education is the same problem as the problem in higher education, which is the same problem in healthcare, which is that mom and dad are not in charge of where the money flows and the decisions based in healthcare, on schools, and for students who are taking out loans, college students who are taking out loans, the federal government has become the dependency state that handles that for you. We don't even allow private providers to do that. As many people in this room know, prior to coming to the foundation, I led my college in Wyoming to reject federal student loans and grants. And I remember a couple of my board members asking me, Kevin, well, you know, on what principle are we making this decision? They were with me, they were just testing me. I said, well, I grew up with the concept that if there's a string from the federal government, you should cut it. And the reason for that is not to be obstinate, because there is a proper role for government. But anytime we remove the consumer from the purchase price, we remove the consumer from being the most important person, most important source of accountability. We've done it in healthcare, we've done it in higher ed, we've done it in K through 12. Not surprisingly, not coincidentally, the quality of all 3 of those services has declined. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that, as you say, the president will continue to fight on this, 140 characters or less. We've all learned that, and I'm grateful. Frankly, we're grateful at the foundation, even on matters where we might not be entirely synced up. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of other issues, just kind of looking ahead. We're told that shortly after the new year in Washington, D.C., that the big emphasis will be on entitlement reform. That excites us, not just because that's the proper attitude toward that policy, but because ultimately we believe in limited government and liberty, because we believe that the last 70 years of federalizing almost everything has undermined the dignity of the human person. And I can think of no better example of that than K through 12 education or the entitlement programs. Some of them well-intentioned, no doubt, but they're really terrible in implementation. Give us some sense of how we might get engaged from a think tank perspective, from the perspective of everyone in the audience listening in, to participate in that, because my speculation is that there's a chance with the President's leadership on that we might make some progress. You want to be a pessimist?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a chance in heck they'd ever take up real Medicare reform or real Social Security reform. Social Security is really easy to fix. You turn a few dials, and you raise the retirement age, and you know, we could go to the private savings. That would be excellent as well. I just don't see they're going to do that. But with caveat, we talked about Medicaid. That is the entitlement that can be changed with absolutely no congressional approval. They can do that through a waiver process where states can apply and say, hey, can I reform this system? And that's the entitlement I think can change. But the other two, I just don't see that happening, particularly after the election in Alabama. The point is you got to have 60 votes on any entitlement change. I don't, you know, they can barely get 50 to do a tax reform, and they're struggling to probably get 51 and get that done. So I don't see that happening. I don't know if I could even see the House Republican Conference going through. And you know, I've helped author with well, when Dr. Price was still there, temporarily the Secretary of HHS. And Jim Jordan and Senators Cruz and the Senate, we all had our entitlement reform bills, and just don't see them going anywhere, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, what I do see with the Medicaid as an option, again, states can go in, submit a request to the Trump administration, has nothing to do with Congress, and get it approved to impose work requirements, impose premiums and cost sharing, all these kind of things that we've done in insurance trying to avoid this third-party problem. That's the problem. Somebody else is paying the bill. I've got teenagers. I know how that works. As long as think about that, somebody else is paying the bill, and we need to fix that. And so on that side, I think it's Medicaid, but not Medicare or Social Security. But one thing the Heartland is working on that has an impact, I think, on all these has to do with potentially reform of the Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. And we just had a day on this, putting together a proposal today in order to approve a new drug. It basically takes, depending on the numbers, anywhere from 10 to 15 years. 10 to 15 years. You know, my mom was diagnosed with an illness that many older folks in this country have. The answer for her is maybe 10 or 15 years. What's the price tag? $2.6 billion to get it through that system. And 10 to 15 years, 2.6. Let me put this in context. In December of last year, Congress, in their great generosity with your money and your kids' money, your grandkids' money, decided to authorize a massive amount for Joe Biden's moonshot on cancer. Remember that? How much did they authorize? $1.8 billion. They were so proud of themselves. That will buy you one drug, maybe. Folks, cancer isn't going to be solved with one drug. But so much of our Medicare, Medicaid, and our costs throughout the entire healthcare system has to do with the expensive nature of trying to get through the FDA. And there are folks in this room trying to figure out how do you make that happen. I mean, this is a way we could really bring costs down by reforming the FDA and finding a way to get through bureaucracy. FDA, their current state, they were basically created in 1962 when John F. Kennedy was president, and they still operate basically in the same manner. And here's one thing that I wonder about, that how this goes by, and but there's the head of the oncology division. I won't say his name because I don't want to create difficulties as trying to reform the FDA, but you can look it up. A couple years ago, again, this is the top gentleman that approves cancer drugs. And this was in the New York Times, so it has to be true. No, it was elsewhere. It was elsewhere. But he approved a drug because his wife had cancer. The drug that was waiting. Why did he approve it? Because his wife needed it. It wasn't for compassionate use, so he grabbed a drug that was waiting and pulled it forward just to make sure. Today, he still speaks on behalf of the FDA. He's still lauded in by various groups that only he did the right, at the end of the day, that shows you that I think that's wrong. Yeah. You should do that for everybody, pulling these drugs up if we could do that. So this is one case where you can lower the cost of so many of our programs and do that in a way that actually makes sense and uses the marketplace rather than the swamp. Trying to, because right now I see the FDA is controlled and captured by a few major companies. And this is one thing the president does get. he'll probably appoint a drug task force. He's talking about doing that. He tweets about it regularly, and I do know at his cabinet meetings, he says, we got to do something about the high cost of drugs. If you go to Japan today, they reformed their version of the FDA a couple years ago based on a model actually put together by a gentleman that works with the Heartland Institute for Regenerative Medicine. I mean, they're a very aging society. We don't want to end up like Japan, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't have children, you don't have families, you eventually have a very aging society, and they have no immigration there as well. It's another issue, and they're a very aging society. But they have changed their system, so they believe they can get drugs through in 4 years that would take 10 years here. Now, I would like to have any politician at any level say, no, just go to Japan if you want your pharmaceuticals for arthritis. No, so we're going to keep the pressure on that. We can do that. So throw cold water on. I don't expect any changes, but obviously Medicare is eating our lunch for the state of Texas, state of Kansas, every other state and the nation, because it's an entitlement mentality. But you could actually switch it around, put some proper incentives in there and personal responsibility, and you can really make some changes. They found out in the state of Kansas, actually, if you do require work, they go to work. And they're better off than they were before. There's actually studies out there that show that comparing someone who has no insurance to someone that's on Medicaid, no health insurance. Again, no health insurance is not no health care. Don't let the left tell us that. That's the difference. You're healthier when you have no insurance rather than being on Medicaid. Now, that's just a study or two, but that's just a shameful indictment that people in this room, that we haven't changed the system to make it work better for those that frankly can't afford so.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your work on the FDA project. We look forward to helping out. Would you throw the same cold water on entitlement reforms that will possibly be in the Farm Bill next summer?
Yeah, I'm not sure what entitlement reforms they'd even propose in there. I was in the committee until I lost my job in that committee. Which, by the way, that's what you do when you try to reform a few entitlements in the Farm Bill. You stand up and say, you know what, I think here was my mortal sin, is that I went on the House floor and offered a very controversial amendment which said if you want to receive food stamps, you should work.
You're heartless.
And that was going to break up the whole grand coalition of food stamps. Ladies and gentlemen, that failed. Okay, that failed. We got about 200 votes. So every Democrat, but a couple of them voted no. I get that. The problem was the leadership of the Ag Committee and the Speaker of the House and others said, no, we can't do that. Well, that's the problem. Where Republicans say they're for work, which is a good, wholesome thing that builds up individuals, builds up families, and makes them more wealthy. And then we have Republicans say, well, we can't do that now. And so that'll be the debate again. So my hope is that'll be the way that they could bring some food stamp reforms. But don't forget, we've got, literally 200 entitlement programs that are based on income, and that's just one of them that they have this requirement. So, but under the Trump administration, they're allowing states to come in and get on Medicaid. But state of Wisconsin, by the way, kudos to the governor and the state legislature that passed a requirement that said you're going to have to work in our state for Medicaid, even if the feds don't allow us to do that. We're starting on January 1st, and we're not waiting anymore on Washington. So kudos to Governor Walker for doing that in the legislature. So every state could do that. No need to wait. Just put the pressure on. And I'm not saying, I think the president's for that, but don't forget there's literally thousands of people below them that have been there for a long time that may not want to make those changes. Sometimes we have to promote some things, maybe with 140 characters, promote them up to maybe the president will see them and get past the swamp that surrounds him on every side.
Well, just to be clear, I'm not really decrying his presence on Twitter. I'm grateful just before we started our session for a particular set of 140 characters in which he has removed the concept of climate change from national security policy.
Yay! And I'll tell you internally, and Heartland's been very active on that. Our founder and our CEO, first CEO, Joe Bass, been working on this for years. But again, Al Gore lost in what year? That was almost the last century. He lost in 2000. His hearings in the late 90s to claim CO2 killed us all is the basis of almost every environmental change related to the climate. It's called the endangerment finding. And it's still going on. Pruitt's working, pushing back, but it was the president himself that says, no, we're going to get out of Paris. Why would we go to Paris and still be there? And so he stood up, and it was very controversial, even amongst his family members, from what I've heard. And but for people out there hoping and thinking America is going to go back and join the UN and go into Paris, that's not going to happen. You go, there's a big picture right inside of the White House. You come in the entrance, first thing you see where I walk in a few times is that picture of him so proud of doing that. So you've got to have people like that are able and willing to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I think is right. And we need more of that. Again, I don't agree with everything he does, but it's so refreshing and so frightening in Washington to those folks that, oh my gosh, he might actually do what he said he's going to do. Yeah. And just a pretty normal American concept that is often lost in Washington.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you've been kind in this conversation. I want to be kind to our audience members as well, give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So you know what is now called the Roberts Rule at TPPF. Please phrase your short comment in the form of a question. And we will have some folks come around, I believe, with microphones. Yes, indeed. Thank you, sir. Raise your hand and we'll take your question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for being here today. Regarding your comments on the FDA's drug approval process, what do you think the likelihood of the Right to Try initiative getting through under Trump is, and what do you think about that initiative as a whole?
Well, thank you for the leadership here in Texas and the foundation working with that. We work with the Goldwater Institute on many issues, and Naomi that works at Goldwater was at our meeting yesterday. I think that's the foundation for some long-term FDA reform. It's such a small piece of that. But when you have doctors, and particularly in the state of Kansas, willing to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to choose my patients over the FDA, that's courageous. And there are real difficulties with doing that, and there's real difficulties with states. So, but 38 states, I think is the number today, said we don't want the feds restricting our ability to pick a medicine down the hallway. Think about this. Here's what's going on. You have trials going on, and with perhaps life-saving, life-affirming drugs. If you get in the trial, by the way, think about it, if you get in the trial, you get a 50% chance you get the drug and 50% chance you don't. All the state of Texas was asking, well, let a doctor decide whether another patient should have that. So I don't know if that's going to happen. To answer your question, it went through the Senate, seems to be stuck in the House. The FDA is still seems to be pushing back a little bit, but we do have Scott Gottlieb as commissioner there. And so we're still trying to figure out, and that was part of the discussion. So, but I think it leads to real long-term reform involving many other drugs. I mean, my goodness, we use our iPhone for how many things? Can you imagine how we can incorporate technology? Here's one of the things that came up yesterday at our conference. Can you imagine, there's some side effects to aspirin. People die from aspirin. Can you imagine if the FDA would approve that today? Think about that. I don't think they would at all, because they can't guarantee almost it's 100% safe. And Right to Try, Louis Gohmert's a friend of mine. I think it was Louis' story, and maybe it's another congressman from Arizona, but of 34 children with leukemia. And they're dying, and there's a drug that saved lives of 33 of them. And the 34th one died, so the FDA says, well, we can't have that drug. We can't. And those are the kind of things they have. Bureaucrats shouldn't be making those decisions, I think. So Right to Try is a good start. But I'm still worried whether that happens. It will take some time. Here's one thing that should frighten you. We had soldiers, and I didn't learn this till yesterday, were dying on the battlefield because the FDA would not allow the use of freeze-dried plasma for soldiers when they were bleeding out. And so the military basically has to follow the rules as well. They were getting some from France, and that became a blow-up. Again, if our soldiers are dying because the FDA won't approve a product that's used in France, shouldn't there be some real public outcry? So we're identifying multiple instances like this where people should be back in charge. And so I'm hopeful, so appreciate the work here in Texas, pushing that forward, the work of the Goldwater Institute on Right to Try.
Thanks for your question. Second row down here, bottom. Microphone's coming your way.
As a physician, what you say strikes me pretty strongly because of the liability issue. And So who takes the liability when you decide to allow a drug to be used generally without what some people consider to be sufficient testing? And, you know, I hark back to when I started medical school. I've done my thing and retired. But in '68, when I was in medical school, focomelia was a big deal. You're born without arms, part of the leg, that sort of thing. And guess what? It was thalidomide. And so I can just imagine how much fun the attorneys are going to have as soon as you start releasing drugs early, because the American public in the nanny state doesn't want to take responsibility. It's got to be that guy's fault.
Yeah.
And then you've got the pharmacy cartel.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The right to try, and any serious FDA reform has to have tort reform as part of that. That's when you also have to rely on states like Texas and Kansas. By the way, we've had probably the best tort laws in Kansas for many years, and Texas actually on that one caught up with us a few years ago, I think, on that. So, but that has to be part of it as well. But here's the decision, though, and under right to try, it's drugs that actually are generally, I think, already in phase 3. And FDA reform would suggest phase 1, maybe phase 1A and B, and they make this pretty complicated. I understand it has to be complicated, but what I'm suggesting, once they pass the initial safety trials, then we should let patients and their doctors start saying, hey, you know, what is really out there? And some people at times make bad decisions. Some people are more risky than others. But here's what FDA doesn't see. And as a member of Congress, I know FDA does not want to be called before a hearing and say the unborn were born without limbs. By the way, that didn't happen here. That was in Europe. So that didn't happen here. That was in Europe. And the drug was not approved for use here.
We were using thalidomide on pregnant women.
Only in trials. The FDA had not approved that yet. Now, I don't know if that was but President Kennedy gave the gal who held that up on accident, gave her an award for keeping that from coming over, and that's why he had to rewrite all that. So, but here's what the FDA doesn't see, is all the folks that are dying because they can't get access to the drugs. Now, Vioxx, the people were dying as well. They call in, we'll rip that off the market, and that's what you see. 40,000 died from that, and I don't know if that's the accurate number. It's the number I saw yesterday. But there were actually folks using Vioxx, still wish they could use it today, but they're not permitted. They're not in the high-risk category. So all we're suggesting in this case is we look at that letting folks decide, not Washington, to do that. So, but that's part of the question we wrestled with yesterday. Do we need to spend $2.6 billion to get the 99.9% safety? I don't think so.
Well, I understand your point. I used to bootleg medicine in from Germany, Holland,
Yeah.
and then had patients sign 15 pages, disclaimer.
Yeah.
Which, of course, would have been useless.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Jones, it's good we did not get your comment about bootlegging medicine on the microphone.
Statute limitations.
Gentleman, right there in the center. Ben will come around to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, on another topic really having to do with higher education. I was on the board of college for 9 years, and what I saw was increases never inuring to the benefit of the student. I saw more rapidly higher education costs going up even than medical costs. And it just meant more administrators and more other things for the college. It didn't inure, nothing inured to the student. What do you see? What's a solution that results in something benefiting the consumer?
Well, parents make all kinds of decisions for where my daughter's going to school, for example. I think parents and alumni need to do a better job of holding schools accountable. And I think my daughter's going to a really good school, but does it really have to cost that much? Why is that? What are they doing on that? Same thing with K through 12. I mean, the administrative overhead just goes up and up and up. But in higher ed, it's interesting, and that's kind of a challenge to us as conservatives. It's like, well, we have a lot more choice in higher ed, so why do we still have this overhead problem? What can we do about it? And I think partly we can blame it on the Washington mandates. But the other thing what's frustrating to me is in a number of arenas is on a related issue is we have a lot of folks, baby boomers retiring, and they're willing a lot of money to colleges and universities that aren't the schools they went to when they were in college, and are far left. And so I would encourage the foundation to say, hey, give the money to the TPPF rather than a university that doesn't support your values. And we see that happening again and again. And so, but we as parents, I'll say this for kids, I got 2 college age and 2 coming, is we've got to be more challenging. Why should the price have doubled? In the last decade, whatever the number is. By the way, the cost, Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, says the cost of getting a drug through the process has gone up 145% in the last 10 years. We can do better. And I'm not sure, higher ed might be pretty darn close to that as well, Kevin. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Microphone's coming your way.
You've described very well a broken two-party system. So I ask you, given that, do you see any realignments of the political landscape? And I'll tell you why, what I see. I heard a radio talk show caller talk about the Democrat Virginia governor's race. He was a conservative Republican. He said he voted against the Republican nominee. I don't know if he said he actually voted for the Democrat or not, but his reason was he was on different sides, and these 2 sides in the Republican Party, I call it the swamp drainers and the swamp dwellers. And the swamp dweller was the nominee, and he did not want that person to win and seem to be successful so that his party would go down that track. Then in the recent Alabama Senate race, I heard a similar thing where the swamp dwellers in the Republican Party wanted to vote against their nominee, actually for the Democrat, because they did not want him to win and be the face and that side of the Republican Party. So this tension, I say, is unsustainable, and it only leads to Democrat victories because they don't have this tension in their party. I'm a libertarian, so I'm trying to be, I think I can be objective here, but the Democrats don't do this to themselves. Whatever differences they had, they would never think to vote for the Republican against their nominee. And so I see this as repeating itself with bad results because the swamp dwellers fight mean, they fight dirty. The swamp drainers just don't have that in them, so they're going to continue to lose. So what's the answer? I think it may be a third party.
So your question, from kind of maybe an academic standpoint, because I don't think we'll get into the partisan side of that, is if there will be a realignment more along the lines of what you're calling swamp drainers and swamp dwellers. Dr. Huelskamp?
Yeah. From an academic perspective, and I've been to a couple conventions, and they weren't the Democrat or the Libertarian convention. But what we've seen in the history of this country is the greatest social movements usually were picked up by 1 or 2 parties. And so I think you potentially see alignment of when you have a president that is so populist in nature. I think that's the best way to put that. It's a danger for folks to oppose him, but Republicans, some of them are doing that. So it's hard to predict where it ends up politically. But I think this ever-growing concern that those guys and gals aren't working for us. I mean, you see it in both parties. You had these rallies of a guy, Mr. Sanders, he spent his honeymoon in the Soviet Union, and all these students showing up and saying he's our guy, but I would argue that there's as much disruption going on in their party as well, over all kinds of issues, and it's they want them to do all kinds of things, and they're not following through. I mean, there's a whole contingent of folks in the Democrat Party that want to impeach Donald Trump. The vote didn't. They can't even get a few to stand up and do that. So, I mean, it keeps moving. But the issue, the social issue, if you look at like the issue of slavery, did one party solve that eventually? It was pulled in by a major party and all kinds of things, and people making a difference, and we went the right direction as a country, thank God. But that caused a realignment, but the same parties were still there. And so I would suggest, I don't see a big change there, but we have a big change in the states where we have this opportunity. So I think you could have some states become bluer and bluer, and some states more and more red. But there was a survey came out I wanted to share. It just shows that the division in the parties as well as the division between the parties. And it's a group in Washington, I think American Principles Project might be involved in, put out a survey that said of the top 5 patriotic brands for conservatives, here's the top 5. NRA, Chick-fil-A, thanks for lunch, Republican Party, Fox News, and Hobby Lobby are the top 5 views of who's patriotic. Now here's the top 5 patriotic brands for liberals. The Democrat Party, the U.S. Supreme Court, Planned Parenthood, New York Times, and the NFL.
I think I'll stick with Chick-fil-A.
Yeah. Now think about that. Think about the divisions we have between the parties and in America. We can't even agree anymore on what in the study is, and there's more coming. We can't even agree what it means to be a patriot anymore. What it means to what's federalism? Who cares is the answer. What does it mean? Today is Bill of Rights Day. Today is Bill of Rights Day. 76 years ago, a Democrat president, think about that, said it was Bill of Rights Day. And most folks obviously don't know what it is, and frankly, they think they do, but don't care about it. So there's incredible divisions, but at the end of the day, I'll just say politics is not going to change that. It's a cultural issue. It's issues of the heart that are going to change and pull us back together, I think.
Thank you. Time for one final question. We'll go to, you're on the left side of the room, but you're on our right, so we're comfortable going that direction.
Well, I hate being the last question to go back to a rather mundane topic, but
Make it good one.
what is preventing the normal order of business budgeting in the Congress? We used to have authorizations and appropriations, and now this sort of rolling budgeting by CR. And then I guess question my premise. Were those days of authorizations and appropriations, were those better in terms of oversight, federalism, accountability?
They were, but those days were from the early 90s is the last time that really happened. What's frustrating to me is you had Republicans for years saying, well, they can't get it done. We can't get, wait a minute. Republicans have everything in Washington, and they still can't get it done. So you can't, it's hard to blame Barack Obama anymore. And so, but the biggest value of having a steady process and a process in which you'd go through the budget of every agency or the 13 parts of the pie, then you could hold the bureaucrats accountable with amendments of restricting their action. And so maybe the Republicans don't care to do that anymore. So yeah, I mean, they didn't pass any budget. They didn't pass any budget bills. How does that happen? You have to say it's the folks that are in charge. It's Republicans on both sides. They've got the votes to do that. They have chosen not to. The specific fear is the reason they didn't finish it 2 weeks ago is because they want to load it up some really bad things at the end of the year. And that's if passes any predictor of the future, it's likely to be a very bad last week of December after we have a good tax reform. So, but yeah, from an academic and a political perspective, do your job. And so you gotta hand it to the leadership on both sides. They just don't care to do their job as a member of Congress. So again, that frustrates me because they would have more authority as an institution if they followed their process. And but they either can't get it together or, even worse, might not want to get it together.
Dr. Tim Huelskamp, president of the Heartland Institute. You're a great American and honorary Texan.
Hey, absolutely.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us. I know a few of you had some more questions. Custom here is great hospitality, so I'm sure that Dr. Huelskamp has a few more minutes if you have questions. Have a wonderful weekend and Merry Christmas to you.